Hello and welcome to the Line Unbroken card reviews for the custom First Stage expansion. Here we are looking at all the cards in the Mastery Sphere, which I'll just read from the First Stage rulebook. The Mastery Sphere is a brand new sphere of influence for the Lord of the Rings, the card game. The Mastery Sphere represents skill in craft or warfare, ambition, and raw passion. Characters in the Mastery Sphere are often peerless in their particular field of expertise, and use their abilities to battle Morgoth on his own terms. However, this power, hubris, and desire for control comes at a price, as those in the Mastery Sphere are vulnerable to corruption and dark deeds. I will also quickly remind you that corruption is represented by placing progress tokens onto characters, and if a character ever has a number of corruption tokens greater than its willpower, it has become corrupted, ceases to be an ally or hero, and becomes an enemy instead. So, with that aside, let us begin with the heroes.
Okay, our first hero then is Feyenoord, who's a 12 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 4 attack, 1 defense, 5 hit points, the Noldor, House of Feyenoord and Noble traits, and his text reads, Action, place 1 corruption on Feyenoord to place 3 progress tokens on the quest, limit once per round. Action, place 1 corruption on Feyenoord to play an attachment from any sphere of influence for no cost.
Now, in the story of the Silmarillion, Feyenoord has multiple big moments, I would say. The general point is that he's pretty much undisputably the greatest jerk ever produced by elves, or possibly any race in the whole of Middle-earth. He's also the one who made the Silmarils in the first place. When they were stolen by Morgoth, he led the Noldor to return to Middle-earth and try and regain them. When the Teleri wouldn't give him ships, he had the people under his command kill them for the ships, and having sailed with his own people back to Middle-earth, rather than send the ships back for those they'd left behind, he decided to just set them on fire. Finally, he got surrounded by Balrogs in the middle of a fight, barely escaped with the help of his sons, and there's a short excerpt here. Then he died, but he had neither burial nor tomb, for so fiery was his spirit that as it sped his body fell to ash, and was borne away like smoke. So, as far as his mechanics go, obviously he clearly benefits from readying effects. 3 willpower is something you want to use, and 4 attack is unprecedented. And he also has 2 incredibly powerful abilities there. The first ability could, of course, be compared to Hero Legolas, but it's more effective and requires no additional trigger. You just put a corruption on him. And the second could be compared to Vilya with Elrond, which, of course, is one of the most powerful things that you can get in the official card pool. Of course, it only works for attachment, but still, you don't need a sphere match, you don't need to pay any cost, so it could be an incredibly expensive attachment that you put into play. The only restriction on the ability is, of course, placing corruption, which, I mean, he has 3 base willpower, and if you can boost that any further, then you get more scope for it, or indeed if you remove corruption using Fingon.
Personally, I've tended to find the attachment one is probably the most powerful in a lot of ways. The extra progress can be very useful in a kind of clutch moment when you need to clear a quest stage, you need to clear an active location, then it can come up, but mostly just the ability to get attachments in effectively for near enough no cost. You've mentioned the lack of a sphere match, so anything expensive from any sphere. The only thing is you can't overuse it.
Yes. Of course, it's also an action, so you don't have to do it in the planning phase. You can do it at any time, just as you can with Vilya, except you can potentially do it multiple times per round. There is a limit once per round on the first ability to place progress, but not the second. That is only limited by Feyenoord's remaining willpower versus corruption. So, I mean, there are some obvious out-of-sphere attachments that you might want to grab from the approved list, certainly. Unexpected Courage. Obviously, Self-Preservation is an attachment which is still quite useful, but a lot of the time people may consider it too expensive. Forest Snare is another one, which, of course, that takes advantage of the timing aspect. Usually, to play a Forest Snare, you have to take an attack from the enemy and then play the snare in the next planning phase. In this case, you could engage the enemy during the encounter phase and then trigger Feyenoord's ability to put a Forest Snare from your hand straight onto the enemy before it attacks, assuming it does not have the first aid Relentless keyword, which means that you can't stop it attacking. There are also, of course, some obvious attachments from the first age itself, such as Luthien's Shadowy Cloak, Eärendil's ship Vingilot, High Kingship of the Noldor, potentially the Ring of Barahir, which I mentioned works very well with Mastery because there are a lot of unique Noldor allies in the Mastery sphere. And it must be said that even without the ability to boost Fëanor's willpower or remove corruption with Fingon, even if you can just use that ability 3 times and that's it, that's still incredibly powerful just to get some of those crucial attachments out in the early game. If you're relying on being able to use Luthien's ability, or if you're relying on being able to have lots of resources from High Kingship, get your allies out with Ring of Barahir, have Eärendil cover all aspects of combat with Vingilot, the fact that you can potentially do multiple of those from round 1 without needing the resources is phenomenally powerful. The last point is that Fëanor's 12 threat is only the standard discount of -1 compared to his stats, which frankly seems a bit undercosted. I think at the full 13 he'd still be worth it.
Yeah, I can see that.
So that may have been a deliberate decision to make him very powerful, because he should be. So let's move on to Thingol.
Thingol is a 7 threat cost hero with 3 willpower, 1 attack, 2 defense, 4 hit points. He has the Teleri and Noble traits, and his text reads, while at least one character with the House of Fëanor trait is in play, Thingol's willpower is treated as 1 for the purposes of corruption. And setup. Choose 10 different cards from your deck and shuffle them into a separate Menegroth deck. After an enemy engages you, draw 1 card from the Menegroth deck.
So in the story, Thingol was for some time the undisputed Lord of Beleriand, and he was certainly the King of Doriath. And it was partly due to the power of his wife Melian of the Maiar, but also partly due to his wisdom that Doriath was one of the elven strongholds which held out the longest against Morgoth. His ability also refers to Menegroth was the capital city of Doriath.
Yes.
Right? Yes. Menegroth was the capital city of Doriath, and he stored a great arsenal of weapons in there, which is what that ability is supposed to represent, that you put certain cards aside to be used when you need them against certain enemies. So firstly, obviously the first ability there is a negative one. He has negative synergy with the House of Fëanor, which I'll just mention now, is of course Fëanor himself and 5 of the allies in the Mastery sphere. For this reason, running a mono Mastery deck is something that's not that likely to work so well, because Thingol will lose out on some corruption ceiling. Though you can certainly choose to do it, but be aware that there is that disadvantage. But the Menegroth deck is the real reason why you want to run Thingol. And there are a couple of different ways you can take it. Of course, it can be difficult in this game to cut down all the way to 50 cards, so maybe you have a slightly oversized deck, except for then 10 cards of it are set aside in the Menegroth deck, and the rest is then a smaller than normal deck, or just a normal 50-card deck. On the other hand, you can have a 50-card deck, of which 10 cards are set aside in the Menegroth deck, meaning you have a 40-card deck that you actually draw from normally, and it's that much quicker for you to find things.
I'd add as well, of course, one of the other main points with the Menegroth deck is that it's obviously a great repository for any combat cards you have. So, assuming access to spheres other than Mastery, in staples like Feint or Hasty Stroke, because you know you will only need those if an enemy has engaged you.
Yeah.
Now, obviously you may not draw the exact one you were looking for at a given moment, but
I would say, aside from the combat aspect, the debate of where you put a certain card between your regular deck and your Menegroth deck is probably down to how many enemies you expect to engage you. Because if you're not just sticking all your combat cards in there, perhaps you don't actually have that many combat cards, you're just using the Menegroth deck to make your regular deck smaller, and more consistent, then if you expect to be engaged by a lot of enemies, then you may well want cards that you really want to see fast in your Menegroth deck, because you'll draw them quickly as all the enemies engage you. Whereas, if you don't expect to engage a lot of enemies, which you certainly may well not, Thingol's 7 threat means you could potentially fit him into a secrecy deck, then under those circumstances, you probably want the really important cards in your main deck, because with it being potentially only 40 cards rather than 50, you will draw them more reliably that way.
I was going to say, because the other thing you've just mentioned is the very low threat cost. It's worth noting that, presumably because of Thingol's negative synergy with the House of Feyenoord, his threat cost is actually 3 points lower than his combined stats, which is... I think it's the lowest discount at the first stage.
Yes, it is. And, of course, since you can choose when building your deck to just not include any of the House of Feyenoord, though they do account for a large proportion of the Mastery Sphere, you can just choose not to include them, at which point you have no disadvantage for Thingol, and he still has only 7 threat.
Okay, the final hero is Torrent. He's a 9 threat cost hero with 1 willpower, 2 attack, 2 defense, 4 hit points, the Edine, House of Hador, and Warrior traits, and his text reads, Action. Raise your threat by 1 to give Torrent plus 1 attack until the end of the round. Response. After Torrent is dealt any amount of damage, discard a character you control to cancel that damage. Limit once per phase.
So, story-wise, Turin was the son of Hurin. Hurin was cursed by Morgoth. I don't remember the details of the curse, other than it was a curse on Hurin and his children. Turin had some fairly dramatic adventures, which I won't go into in detail, but the other really notable point about him was that he tended to be rather reckless and get his friends killed as a result of that, which is obviously what the second ability there is representing. When he takes damage, you can just have someone else die in your stead. So let's look at the second ability first. It's very powerful because I know you have used it a lot to essentially allow you to chump block with an ally that has already done something, like, say, Quest, and without them actually having to defend.
Yeah,
you can just take the attack undefended.
Yeah, it's obviously, you're risking shadow effects that punish undefended attacks that way, but other than that, you know there's no problem with defending character takes damage, as there is with a lot of chump blocking. Say, you've already used the character to do something else useful. I'm sure this means you probably won't be able to use them for their presumably willpower later on, but equally, other alternatives, you can, even if you've got a suitably expendable ally, have them defend an attack, survive, and then take another one through Turin's ability.
Yes.
The other, obviously, great synergies with any temporary ally, compared to something like, say, Corset Gandalf.
Yes.
It's not on the approved
list,
of course, but anything comparable to that.
Ally Elrond is on the approved list.
Yes.
Ally Galadriel is on the approved list.
Because if all you've done with them is quests, you've done that already, they're going to disappear at the end of the round, so...
You may as well just discard them early.
Exactly, a similar principle to why you always put archery damage on allies like that.
As to the first ability, it's important to note that there is no limit to that action. You can keep increasing Turin's attack so long as you have more threat before you hit 50, which means, of course, that you can do it exactly. If there's an enemy that you really want dead straight away, you can just raise Turin's attack and raise your threat until the point where he can kill it in one hit. Even if you have no other attacking characters. That may be a fairly significant threat raise, so you may want to pair up with the Spirit Sphere for threat reduction, but you can do it. If there's any battle questing that you need to do anywhere in the first stage, I don't remember any.
I can't remember any off the top of my head.
No, but it's possible, say, that a mono-tactics deck decides to play Trained for War. I think the tactics side quest, Delay the Enemy, is on the approved list. So either of those things could cause you to be battle questing, and then again you can just raise your threat the exact amount you need to clear however much of the quest you want to.
The other thing that's worth noting about that as well is if you can get into a battle questing situation, it's a point where being able to ready Turin would also be relevant because the attack boost lasts until the end of the round. So you can boost his attack to clear a battle quest stage, ready him up, and he will be hitting just as hard in the combat phase.
Yep. So yes, also an incredibly powerful ability, and it's worth noting that his threat cost is in fact equal to his stats. Only the second such hero, and I think him and Fingon are the only two who have threat equal to their stats in the first stage. A clear representation of how powerful these two abilities can be. So let's move on to the allies. Our first ally is Aeol. He's a 4-cost ally with 2 willpower, 1 attack, 3 defense, 2 hit points. He is unique. He has the Teleri trait, and his text reads, Action. Place 1 corruption on Aeol to search the top 15 cards of your deck for an attachment, and add it to your hand.
The first thing I'd note about Aeol is that while it is completely unthematic, he works very well with Feyenoord, inevitably, because you can just use his ability to pull attachments out of your deck, which Feyenoord can then play.
For no cost.
Yes.
You're throwing around a certain amount of corruption to do this.
Yes, indeed. One strategy I have been known to use, although of course it gets expensive because he is an expensive ally, is use his ability to pull attachments out of the deck which Feyenoord can play, and then if you're running Feyenoord and Turin can just discard him to defend, and you can pull out another copy and do the same again.
The obvious comparison here in the official card pool is the Master of the Forge, with the significant difference is that there's no limit on how much Aeol can use his ability. He doesn't have to exhaust for it, except, of course, his willpower. So in a single round, he can do it more. Over the course of a game, he can do it less, unless it's a very short game. But you also get to search 15 cards rather than only 5. He is more expensive. The fact he doesn't have to exhaust means you can use his stats, which 2 willpower for questing or 3 defense on an ally. Both of those are things you can make a lot of use of. So it's kind of hard to weigh up which you might want more, probably depending on how many mastery resources you think you'll have to pay for him.
Okay, our next ally then is Callaghan, who is a 3-cost unique ally with 1 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points, the Noldor and House of Feyenoord traits, and his text reads, Callaghan gains +1 attack for each non-unique location in the staging area, and action. Place 1 corruption on Callaghan to search the top 10 cards of the encounter deck for a location and add it to the staging area.
So, of course, Callaghan is one of the 7 sons of Feyenoord, 5 of whom are represented as allies. The comparison I make in the official card pool is Lord Faramir. Of course, Faramir gains an attack bonus for enemies in the staging area. Now, locations is potentially easier because they don't leave the staging area unless you choose to travel to them. On the other hand, the fact that they stay in the staging area means they continue contributing threat and you run a risk of getting location locked. There is the handy point that Callaghan's second ability, the action, allows you to boost his attack at will, though since you have to place a corruption on him to do it, and he has 1 willpower, you're probably not going to do that a lot, and will mostly have to rely on the encounter deck to give you the locations for that attack boost. But then it is rare and somewhat notable to have a stat boost that doesn't actually require you to attach anything to the character.
I personally think he's probably the least useful of the Sons of Feyenoord, which kind of indicative of the others we will get to shortly.
Yeah.
But
he's certainly the one that we have used the least.
Yes.
I think if we tried to play around his ability more, then maybe
I see that.
it could actually work out
I think it's
better.
also perhaps he might work better in a multiplayer context, because if you're running 3 or 4 players, then firstly, you're probably drawing more locations anyway, so his attack boost is higher. And secondly, if you're running 3 or 4 player games, you pretty much have to have a plan for dealing with location lock. So, whereas in a single player game, you are maybe drawing 1 location per round, and he's just an expensive ally with a limited use stat line.
Yes. The one point is, of course, that you can use his action if there is a location in the encounter deck that you particularly want to see. Then looking through the top 10 cards, you stand a decent chance of finding it. So our next ally is another one of the Sons of Feyenoord. It is Maglore. He is a unique 4-cost ally with 3 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points. He has the Noldor and House of Feyenoord traits, and reads Response. When a corruption token would be placed on a character you control by an encounter card effect, exhaust Maglore to place that corruption token on Maglore instead.
I think he's a worthwhile ally to play, but I don't know if I've ever actually managed to use his ability, because more often than not, I'm just likely to want to quest with that 3 willpower.
Yeah.
The flip side, I suppose, I can see a situation where you're not that worried about your willpower. You've got enough on the table, but the encounter deck has enough things that are throwing corruption at you that being able to use Maglore instead of having it potentially hitting, say, a 0 willpower ally and immediately corrupting them.
Yes, it's notable that some encounter deck corruption effects target characters specifically, or some let you choose which are targeted, and some just will pick someone at random. So under some of those circumstances where you can't choose to put it on a character with more willpower, you will find it useful to have something like Maglore if he's ready instead of being questing.
Moving on to our next ally, who is another of the Sons of Feyenoord. This one is Thea, and he's a 3-cost ally with 0 willpower, 2 attack, 1 defense, 3 hit points, the Noldor and House of Feyenoord traits, and his text reads, Response. After a treachery is revealed and resolved, attach that card face down to Thea. That attachment gains the Fury trait, limit once per round. And action. Attach a Fury attachment to an enemy engaged with you. That enemy gets +1 attack and -1 defense.
So the first thing I would note is that he has 0 willpower, which in the first stage is something of a liability because he can be easily corrupted. And with 2 attack, that's not so bad, a 2 attack enemy, but it's not totally meaningless either. So as far as his ability goes, it's a very useful one potentially. There are always going to be these situations where you're just short 1 point of attack to kill something. Attaching the Fury attachment is just an action that can be done at any time, so you can wait until the enemy has attacked you, then attach the Fury attachment to reduce its defense so that you can kill it.
I tend to see the Fury attachments as using them essentially only when it is absolutely needed, as you covered.
The other aspect of his ability is the first part, the response. If you just don't bother using those Fury attachments, then you can just slowly but surely remove all of the treacheries from the encounter deck. Obviously, it would take a long time to take all of the treacheries out of the encounter deck, especially since there's a limit once per round.
So in practice, it's probably not going to happen, but...
But you can at least reduce the number, and especially in, say, a 4-player game, you're going through the encounter deck multiple times. That will be very handy. It also pairs very nicely with Erendil, since his ability will work better if there are less treacheries in the encounter deck. So our next ally is Glen. He is a 3-cost unique ally with 0 willpower, 2 attack, 1 defense, 2 hit points. He has the Noldor and Teleri traits. He belongs to both sides of the elves. And he reads Response. After the active location is explored, add 1 resource to a hero's resource pool. 2 resources instead if you place 1 corruption on that hero.
The first 2 points I would note about him are, firstly, that he has resource generation in a sphere that isn't leadership. The second thing is that he doesn't need to exhaust to do, well, anything other than use his stats. It's not an exhaust to do this. Now, you're still unlikely to trigger that ability multiple times per round in most cases, because obviously it requires the active location.
You have to explore more than 1 active location.
Exactly, and that's...
Which you could do using Feyenoord's first ability, if you explore 1 location during questing, and then travel to another, and trigger Feyenoord to place 3 progress and explore it. But the majority of the time, it's once per round.
Yeah. But even that, getting him into play relatively early means that he'll just be generating, say, an extra resource per round.
2 if you have willpower to spare,
Yes.
and contributing his stats
Yeah.
to combat.
There are some other reasons why the ability to spread a bit of corruption around can even be beneficial in at least one case, but that's
Yes.
based on an attachment that we haven't gotten to yet. So.
Yes. The one other aspect is that, again, he's a character with 0 willpower, so he's very vulnerable to corruption himself. So our next ally.
Yep. Madras. Madras is a 5-cost ally with 3 willpower, 3 attack, 2 defense, 3 hit points, the Noldor and House of Feyenoord traits, and his text reads, while Madras has no corruption on him, all Noldor characters get +1 willpower. While Madras has at least 1 corruption on him, all characters with the House of Feyenoord trait get +1 attack, and action, place 1 corruption on Madras.
So he has a very heroic stat line. That stat line is better than most of the heroes, even in the first stage, where stat lines are generally pretty great. So he's worth his 5 resources just for that.
Assuming you can afford them, obviously,
Yes.
which is the...
Yes.
The
So,
usual
I mean,
catch.
if you have some means of reducing cost, like, say, Secret Toil or the Ring of Barahir, which, again, I've mentioned, works very well with the Mastery Sphere. In general, if you can get him in for cheaper than those 5 resources, that's very handy, but if you just save up the 5 resources, he is worth it. And then we move on to his abilities as well.
Which also could be compared to sort of hero-level abilities, because, an extra point of willpower for all Noldor in play, which of course includes himself, so his printed willpower may be 3, but as long as he's not at all corrupted, that's 4.
And he also gets you 4 on Feyenoord, 4 on Fingon, 4 on Finrod, and so on and so on. That extra point of willpower gives you more corruption for triggering some of these mastery effects, and indeed for not being corrupted by random corruption from the encounter deck.
Though, of course, all of that is contingent on any corruption from the encounter deck not landing on Madras.
Yes, so maybe you want to pair him with Maglore. Maybe this is the reason that you want Maglore. Madras is giving you all the willpower that you need, so you can afford to just keep Maglore ready so that he can take any corruption that flies towards Madras.
And given equally that Maglore would have 4 willpower under those conditions, it's going to be a while before it's a problem.
Yes. The other aspect, the attack boost, can also be useful. It's probably less useful the majority of the time because questing is generally more important than attacking, but sometimes you really want to kill that enemy. And of course, you don't have to place the corruption by any other means. Madras has a free switch in his own text box to switch over to the other ability. You may, however, want to have Fingon in play to remove that corruption afterwards and get your willpower back.
While the attack boost is more limited use because it applies to a smaller subset of characters, specifically the House of Feyenoord, it will still put Madras up to 4 attack. It puts Feyenoord up to 5 attack.
Yeah.
Those are the big ones, obviously still potentially useful.
At
on
most,
the others.
if you have all of the House of Feyenoord in play, it's giving you an extra 6 attack across all 6 of them, which is pretty good. So, our next ally, the last of Fëanor's sons represented in the game, is Kurra. He is a unique 3-cost ally with 2 willpower, 2 attack, 0 defense, 3 hit points. He has the Noldor and House of Feyenoord traits, and reads, while Fëanor is in play, Kurra gains action. Place 1 corruption on Kurra. Until the end of the round, Kurra's willpower, attack, and defense are equal to the printed willpower, attack, and defense of Fëanor. And I'm just going to also mention his flavor text here, which reads, Kurra the Crafty, who inherited most of his father's skill of hand. He is generally described as being kind of the most like his father, certainly in terms of his skills of crafting things and so on. He is also the father of Celebrimbor, who you may have heard of. He made these elven rings that are sort of important.
In terms of game mechanics, Kurra, in practical terms, that 1 corruption will be netting you either 1 additional willpower or 2 additional attack. or both if you actually have a means of readying him, obviously.
Yes.
Obviously, you can use that, therefore, as an emergency quest push or a sudden extra little bit of attack as needed. It's probably best equally to do that, to use that ability only when you need it. Though, of course, if you have the means of removing corruption from him, then you can use it more times than his printed willpower would suggest.
Of course, it's worth noting one significant aspect is that, as it reads, Currafin's willpower attack and defense are equal to the printed willpower attack and defense of Feyenoord. So any additional boosts to Kurrafin do not apply because it just says his willpower attack and defense, as in his total willpower attack and defense. So if, for instance, Madras is in play, giving all Noldor +1 willpower, and then you trigger Kurrafin, according to the ability, his willpower is still only 3. It's not... Well, I suppose you could debate that, but as I read it, it would still be only 3. And indeed, if you've boosted Feyenoord's stats at all, those boosts do not then reflect onto his son. One additional aspect of it is that, although I haven't asked Ian about this ability specifically, I have asked a tangentially related rules question in the official game. That rules question, incidentally, was about triggering abilities by damaging characters while Cauldron Angmar is in play, to which the answer was that you get to fully resolve the ability before their text box becomes blank. And so in this case, I would interpret it similarly, that if Kurrafin already has 2 corruption on him, you can trigger his ability a 3rd time, and you will get to fully resolve it, making his willpower equal to Feyenoord's printed 3 willpower, and so he will not yet be corrupted, because he has 3 corruption and 3 willpower. However, at the end of the round, the ability will stop functioning, he will go back down to 2 willpower and still have 3 corruption on him, and then become corrupted. That concludes all of the allies in the Mastery Sphere. I'll just mention again that the Ring of Barahir works very well, because all of those allies apart from Eöl have the Noldor trait, and they're all kind of expensive. So now moving on to attachments.
Okay, our first attachment then is the Oath of Feyenoord, which is a 1-cost attachment with the Oath trait. It reads, attached to a character with the House of Feyenoord trait, limit 1 per character. Corruption on the attached character cannot be removed. And planning action, exhaust Oath of Feyenoord to switch the printed attack and willpower of the attached character until the end of the round.
Now, in principle that sounds interesting, but in practice I've never found it to be that useful, and there is a very simple reason why. It is that one word, printed. So if we look at the hero and allies with the House of Feyenoord trait, Maglore, you could get him to have 3 attack instead of 1, and only 1 willpower. But of course, if you're using his ability to soak up corruption, then doing that would probably cause him to become immediately corrupted. Kurrafin's willpower and attack are the same,
as indeed are Callaghan's and Madras's. Feyenoord himself, it's basically +1 willpower for -1 attack, which could have some use, except the inability to remove corruption from Feyenoord is probably going to cause you more than a few issues.
Yes, well, if you're planning on removing it anyway. I suppose if you are just intending to use it at the start of the game to speed up your start, then maybe you can make use of this just for those occasions when you want 1 more willpower. And finally, Thea has 0 willpower and 2 attack.
Yeah, Thea is probably the best target in all the ways, because Thea will not have any corruption on him at all, because he doesn't have the willpower for it. Therefore, the ability to switch his 2 attack into willpower so he can actually quest might actually be relevant.
Yes.
But it's...
especially when you may have all the attack power that you want. I mean, potentially you can even trigger the second ability on Madras to get some more, if you really need it. And the final point to note is, of course, that Hold to the Oath, the 1-cost leadership event, will boost any character who has an oath attached, which includes this. So our next attachment is a very interesting one. It is Nauglamir. It is a unique 6-cost attachment with the item, artifact, and Silmaril traits. It reads, lower the cost to play Nauglamir by 1 for each dwarf in play, attached to a hero. Each hero you control gets +1 willpower, +1 attack, and +1 defense. Forced. At the start of the combat phase, Discard a resource from the attached hero's resource pool for each dwarf in play. Any dwarf for which you did not discard a resource immediately becomes corrupted. And I'd just like to explain this in story terms. The Nauglamir was originally a necklace given by the dwarves to Finrod Felagund as a gesture of friendship. It was after Finrod died and his city was destroyed, the Nauglamir was retrieved and given to Thingol of Doriath, and then he decided to set the Silmaril Baron and Luthien had retrieved from Morgoth into the Nauglamir. But since the Silmaril is like the One Ring, in that if you see it, you want it, the dwarves then wanted to take the Nauglamir. Thingol refused in a fairly rude fashion, and they killed him for it, thus explaining the forced ability. If you don't pay off the dwarves, then they'll try to kill you.
Yes, this is a really interesting attachment. The first really obvious thing is play it with Feyenoord, because 6 resources... It's probably worth those 6 resources.
It is absolutely worth 6 resources. Assuming you have 3 heroes, that's an extra 9 points of stats you're getting.
Yes. But it is a lot easier to just play it with 1 point of corruption.
Especially since, of course, your corruption is limited by your willpower, so you place 1 corruption on Feyenoord to play Nauglamir, which increases his willpower, so it's effectively free in that regard. There is, of course, the option of using the cost reduction of dwarves, which, the thing is, it's obviously a trade-off. You have to consider whether you really want to have to keep paying off those dwarves every combat phase for the rest of the game, or if you want to just let them become corrupted and then kill them, if that is worth having Nauglamir in play. In practice, we tend to just go either we use Nauglamir or we use dwarves.
Incidentally, of course, if I'm remembering the text correctly, it's also a whole table decision.
Yes. Yes, it is each dwarf in play, not just that you control. So, I mean, maybe if you only want to have 1 dwarf in play, you can afford 1 resource per round, but yes, it's a problem. Yes, Secret Toil, of course, would be another way to get this in cheaply, and I would say that would also be incredibly worth it.
Our next attachment then is Galvorn Armour, which is a 2-cost attachment with the item and armour traits. Attached to a mastery hero, limit 1 per hero. Attached hero gets +1 defense. Attached hero gets an additional +1 defense for each corruption on the attached hero.
So this can be an interesting one, because it gives a defense boost, but to get a good defense boost out of it, you need to have corruption, which means you need to have willpower, and those tend to diverge. Generally, characters who have good willpower don't necessarily have good defense as well. There are exceptions. But also, of course, it only attaches to mastery heroes, for which Feyenoord has 3 willpower and 1 defense. Torrent has 2 defense, but only 1 willpower. Thingol has 3 willpower and 2 defense, making him possibly the most natural target for it.
Personally, I'd say any of the 3 mastery heroes can work pretty well for different reasons. As I say, Thingol is the most natural target, at least as long as one of the Sons of Feyenoord or Feyenoord himself are not in play.
Yes.
Turin is kind of an easy fit just because he is essentially an all-round combat hero. You won't get as big a defense boost from the Galvorn armour, because there won't be that much corruption on him, but he's already starting from 2 defense, and also is unlikely to be questing, because of that 1 willpower. And Feyenoord's an interesting one, because normally I wouldn't play Galvorn armour onto Feyenoord, but in practice, on a few rare occasions, I have done so and found it can work really well, because while Feyenoord's printed defense is only 1, once you factor in the Galvorn armour's initial boost of 1, well, that's up to 2. And you are stacking corruption on him to do things.
Yeah, that's the thing.
He can possibly get the highest defense of the lot of
them. If we assume no other attachments, just the Galvorn armour, you can put up to 3 corruption on Feyenoord, which means that for this 2-cost attachment, you're getting 4 defense, putting him up to a total of 5, and you already want to have readying effects on him. So, I mean, that is the aspect in which Feyenoord has the best synergy with it, because you can put corruption on him pretty much at will. So if you really want to get your defenses up, potentially even if a shadow card is revealed that will do some damage to him and you don't want to take that damage, you can use his first ability, if you haven't already done it that round, to put a corruption on him, put some progress on the quest, and that will stop him taking damage from the Galvorn armour. This, incidentally, of course, was the attachment which David mentioned, where spreading corruption around can be useful with Maglen's resource acceleration ability.
Yeah, because I've always figured it's easy to get corruption onto Feyenoord, but getting some onto, say, Thingol or Turin, obviously the other targets for the Galvan armour, that's trickier. The encounter deck can do it, there are other mastery cards that can do it, but Maglen is a good starting point.
So our next attachment is the Poisoned Javelin. It is a 2-cost attachment with the item and weapon traits. It reads, attached to a mastery character, restricted. Response. After attached character damages an enemy, attach Poisoned Javelin to that enemy. Forced. At the end of each round, if Poisoned Javelin is attached to an enemy, deal 2 damage to that enemy. You may place 1 corruption on a hero you control to increase this to 4 damage.
Well, first thing I'd say is it is a little bit tricky to use sometimes because of being restricted. Essentially, you tend to want your mastery characters to have other things in their restricted slots, or certainly your heroes. So
yes, it's notable that it can be attached to characters, not just heroes.
But I always think that the obvious comparison is Poison Stakes.
Yes.
I personally think that it works best against an enemy with a decent amount of hit points, because one of the things I always find with effects like that is, yes, you'll be dealing a bunch of hit point damage, but wouldn't you prefer to have just killed them outright in one go?
Yeah.
Whereas, just think of the sort of big boss enemies.
Yes.
Then, if they can actually have attachments, then damage them enough to put the javelin into them, and it will just tick their health down over a few rounds.
Yeah,
anyway.
If you expect to take a few rounds to kill them, in any case, this obviously applies.
Exactly. I find myself thinking, of course, of one thing that isn't in the first stage, but if there were a kind of first stage enemy that's equivalent of the Mumak...
Yeah, that can only take a limited amount of damage per round, then this could be an easy solution. You damage it once, stick in the javelin, and then just wait.
Of course, it still requires to be an enemy that isn't precisely like Mumak, because it needs to be able to actually have attachments.
Yes. In the Poisoned Stakes comparison, I would say this is better than Poisoned Stakes, because Poisoned Stakes, like all traps, you can't target it on a specific enemy, whereas this, you attach it to a character, and then you choose to trigger the response and attach it to an enemy when you actually need it. So you just wait until there's that situation where either it's an enemy with lots of hit points that you want to tick down over time, or an enemy where you're just short 2 or 4 points of attack to kill it outright, and figure you'll just use this. If you're able to take the corruption, then I'd say it's definitely more worth it. Otherwise, you've spent 2 resources to have 2 extra attack once, whereas 2 for 4 extra attack once is more impressive.
Our next attachment then is Girth Hang, which is a unique 2-cost attachment with the item and weapon traits, and it reads, attached to a hero with a printed mastery resource icon, restricted. Attached hero gets +1 attack. Response, after attached hero damages an enemy, shuffle the encounter deck and discard the top card. If it is a treachery, cancel all damage from the attack and discard a hero. Otherwise the enemy is destroyed.
Now, Girth Hang was Turin's sword, and it definitely played into him accidentally getting people killed, because it was sort of implied that the sword had an ill will of its own, and would strike in the wrong places at times. So as far as the ability goes, it's obviously kind of a gamble. You definitely want to know your encounter deck to know how many treacheries there are. If you're in a quest that has close to a 50-50 split between treacheries and locations, for example, which exists, you don't want to use this.
I know, I don't think I've ever actually managed to use the ability on it. It would work well if you're trying to do the Caranthea bit of pulling all the treacheries out of the encounter deck.
Yeah,
but
it works well with Caranthea. It also works well with Erendil, because you only shuffle the encounter deck, not the discard pile. So if you combine those two together, then you can definitely thin out the number of treacheries. And indeed, I suppose, if you use effects like Out of the Wild or the Lore side quest Scout Ahead to remove treacheries from the encounter deck and put them in the victory display, that also gives you better chances.
Yeah. There's also a theoretical possibility when the encounter deck has gotten down to just a few cards left and you know that there are no treacheries in there, then you can use it safely. I think the catch is that using it safely is... It's basically, since it is a huge thing, because you're risking one of your heroes otherwise.
It's not designed for you to be able to use it safely. That's sort of the point in terms of the theme.
In practice, it therefore can just turn into a very expensive attack boost.
Yeah.
But...
Well, 2 for 1, it's not super expensive, but it's a bit more expensive than most. The one other aspect I would potentially consider is that if, assuming you're not playing campaign mode or anything, so you don't mind if you lose heroes so long as you win the quest, if you have a boss enemy that you're going to struggle to kill otherwise, then maybe you just use this and bank on the fact that you have 3 tries to destroy the enemy without discarding all of your heroes, so long as your allies can cover other aspects. So our next attachment is Mormagill. It is a unique 1-cost attachment with the Name trait, and reads, attached to Turin Turambar, limit 1 name in play. Turin Turambar gains a tactics resource icon. All enemies get -1 threat and -10 engagement cost.
I think the first thing which I'd say is obviously you can compare it to a Song of Battle with an extra aspect to it, which is essentially there's an element of why not in some ways if you're okay with the rest of it. The negative to engagement cost isn't always a liability as well, of course. If you've got a deck that is good at handling a decent amount of combat, and some mastery decks are, with Turin in particular, then having enemies more likely to engage you can actually work out well for you. Of course, in multiplayer, you can, on the other hand, run into you might be ready to engage more enemies, but the rest of the table isn't.
It's worth noting that, of course, there is limit 1 name in play. This is the only name attachment in the initial first age set, but we will be getting more as we move into the Doom-mastered cycle. Turin was a man of many names. This one in particular, Mormagill, means the Black Sword. And our final attachment
is Ruth, which is a unique 2-cost attachment with the item and weapon traits, and it reads, attached to a hero with a printed mastery icon, restricted. Action. Exhaust Ruth to give attached hero a leadership, law, tactics, or spirit icon until the end of the phase. And if attached hero is Thingol, Ruth gains attached hero gets +2 attack.
Yes, Ruth was, of course, Thingol's sword, hence the extra bonus. I will mention, and this also applied to Girth Hang, there is no way to gain a non-printed mastery icon at present, but one may exist in the future. So Ruth, the obvious comparison in the official card pool is Navi's Belt on Dwarves. It does exactly the same thing, except for the extra attack boost onto Thingol. Putting Ruth onto Thingol obviously makes him much more of a good target for readying effects like Unexpected Courage, because then he has 3 willpower and 3 attack, and you could also give him Galvorn armor, so he has 3 defense or possibly more. And I would say that can potentially make him kind of the perfect splash hero for mastery, because you can give him his sword so that he will have all resource icons, well, 1 other resource icon per round, and he's only 7 threat, and he has useful stats.
I think it's important not to get too caught up in it has to go on Thingol as well, because any of the mastery heroes, it's still a useful ability.
Oh, yes.
Essentially, even without being on Thingol, it's Navi's Belt for the same cost.
Yeah, yes. I just say that I think Thingol is the best in terms of using him as a splash hero in that regard because of his 7 threat. Otherwise, it also pairs very well with Feyenoord because you quite probably have attachments from other spheres with Feyenoord because you can play them using his ability, but this gives you another way of doing it that doesn't eat up his willpower.
It's perhaps less obvious on Turin, but if Turin's the only mastery hero you have, then it's still...
You can consider it if you want to have that. So we move on to the events. Madness of Rage is a 0-cost event which reads, action. Choose a character you control. Until the end of the phase, that character gets +3 attack and must attack alone.
Firstly, I'd mention it's one of the combat cards that I was thinking of when we were talking about the Maglore deck.
Yeah.
Otherwise, the obvious comparisons are things like Khazad or Unseen Strike. because it's basically a free attack boost under the right conditions. It can obviously be a bit variable. Khazad is dwarves, that's relatively straightforward. Unseen Strike is a low threat option. Here, the main point is if you are powering up a single attacker, then it can work pretty well. I mean, you can, for example, actually just use it to effectively save yourself 3 threat on Torrent in the early game.
Yeah, in general, I would say this is going to obviously compete for deck space with attacking allies, because the allies are repeatable, but they also, a lot of them will have less than 3 attack, and they will cost more than 0. And of course, there's the aspect of this that you have to attack alone when you use it. So it's only good if you are building up one very powerful attacker, so you can't swarm down an enemy. And sometimes there'll be those cases where you need 4 more attack to kill that enemy, so this won't do it, but having, say, 2 allies, each of whom has 2 attack, would work.
Okay, our next event then is Fire of Life, which is another 0-cost event with the condition trait. It reads, response. After a character with the House of Feyenoord trait is damaged, cancel 1 point of that damage and attach Fire of Life to that character. Counts as a condition attachment with the text, limit 1 per character, attached character gets +1 attack.
So, obvious comparisons in the official card pool, Gondorian Discipline and Dunedain Mark for the attack boost. It's obviously cheaper than Dunedain Mark, doesn't cancel as much damage as Gondorian Discipline, and is perhaps more restricted in who it can target, but it combines the 2 effects. It's just very useful, to be honest. And of course, it's any point of damage. It doesn't have to be from an attack, so if there's an enemy with archery, or if there's direct damage from a treachery or something like that, you can just say, okay, I put 1 point of this onto Feyenoord, or one of Feyenoord's sons, and then I'll play Fire of Life to cancel that damage, so it just vanishes and you get +1 attack.
One note I did make is that it is very generally good for having to defend unexpectedly, or for having to take an undefended attack that you didn't want to, or say for direct damage. I mean, I have sometimes used this when I've had to take an undefended attack which would kill Feyenoord if I weren't able to cancel 1 point of damage. Yeah. It also makes him better for the counter-attack, so it hopefully won't keep happening. Indeed, I'd say probably the 2 best targets for it are Feyenoord and Madras, because they've already got higher attack values and high hit point pools, or relatively high hit point pools.
Well, it depends on where the damage is coming from.
Yes, of course.
Because, as I say, it could just be archery or direct damage from a treachery, so Thea obviously is not doing anything other than attacking, most likely.
That's true. The only limitation that, of course, is the fact you can only attach 1 to each character.
Yes. So our next event is Defied and Mocked. It is a 1-cost event which reads, action. Choose an ally. That ally can be assigned damage from undefended attacks until the end of the phase.
I think the first thing I'd say is I don't think I've ever actually managed to use that card. It's another one of those cards that you can potentially see the value of it in theory, but you just never get around to fitting it into a deck. On the other hand, it is a useful thing. I'll bring up the possibility of temporary allies again.
Yep.
Because that's the most obvious way of using it.
So the obvious comparison to me is Defender of the West from the Ringmaker cycle. That is a 1-cost attachment that effectively turns a unique ally into an objective ally that moves around with the first player token and can take undefended attacks. That one, of course, you have to plan for it. Whereas with Defied and Mocked, you just save it for an emergency and you can choose any ally. It doesn't have to be one of your allies, handily. So if your fellow player is swarmed by too many enemies, you can pick one of their allies to take some of the undefended attacks. It's worth noting, of course, that it's until the end of the phase, so if they have a large hit point pool on this ally, they can take multiple undefended attacks.
Or indeed if they're simply being attacked by enemies with low attack.
Yeah. And this is one more way that we can deal with undefended attacks in the first stage, which there are quite a few. As I mentioned, Findwilas and Turin, and possibly something else that I've forgotten.
Our next event then is Dreadful Death, a 0-cost event. Reads, response. After a corrupted character destroys a hero or ally, remove all corruption from that character and place it under your control.
So, obviously, you can compare this to No Better Hope, the spirit card, which allows you to exhaust a hero to simply discard a corrupted character. This requires you to kill off one of your heroes or allies, most likely allies, to get the character back, but it doesn't require exhausting a hero, and you get the character back rather than discarding them. And so, again, it's a case of how often are your characters going to get corrupted. I could potentially see a situation where you actually plan to use this, even. So, say if you're using Feyenoord, you can corrupt him 3 times to get attachments into play, possibly put progress on the quest, and then maybe you decide, alright, I'll corrupt him a 4th time, put in another attachment, he becomes corrupted, but then I have a wimpy ally that I can just throw at him and play this zero-cost event to bring him back with no corruption, and then I can do it all over again.
Certainly a viable strategy as long as you didn't have any important attachments on Feyenoord.
Yes, because those would be discarded.
Yes. Yeah, I know this is another one that I don't think I've ever actually managed to use, but I can certainly see it's viable. As you say, I can see that you could
I think it's one of those cases where you look at it at first and see it as just an emergency measure, so you plan to not use it. But if you plan to kind of abuse it the way that I've just described, where you deliberately engineer the situation where you need it...
Yeah, so one thing I noted is there aren't that many ways of removing corruption.
Yeah.
So having another one which essentially does...
Yeah, well, this does remove corruption.
Yes, it explicitly calls it out. It's just you have to wait until a character actually becomes corrupted.
Yeah.
So yes, another option there doesn't hurt, certainly.
Yeah, so you can include it for a case where you want to deliberately engineer the situation, or you can just include it as an emergency measure in case. That would be particularly relevant in a quest that has a lot of encounter card corruption effects.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that stands out is, in that sense, it's fairly quest-specific, if you're thinking along those lines.
Our next event is Dark Heart of the Smith. It is a zero-cost event which reads Action. Place 1 corruption on a character with a unique weapon attached. All damage dealt by that character is doubled this round. Only 1 copy of Dark Heart of the Smith may be played on a character each round.
Well, obviously, you need a unique weapon, which means Ruth or Girth Hang, which in some ways adds to the utility of playing Girth Hang, even if you're not going to trigger the ability. I also know it works very well with Torrent because you can essentially just keep multiplying up that threat raise.
Yeah, because it means that once you bypass the enemy's defense... So, say, in fact, you have allies with enough attack to match the enemy's defense, and so then Torrent is just doing all the damage. Then you raise your threat by 1 to get, effectively, 2 more attack, because the damage is doubled.
It also arguably can work well with, just any attack boost. I mean, I have used it in conjunction with Madness of Rage as well.
Yeah, zero-cost event gets you 6 more damage.
Yes.
The obvious comparison in the official card pool is Heavy Stroke. This has the difference that I think Heavy Stroke only applies to 1 attack. It also costs a resource, whereas this is until the end of the round. So if you have readying effects on your powerful attacker, especially if it's Torrent, you raise your threat to increase his attack, and then attack multiple times, and each time the damage is doubled.
The only limitation, of course, as well, is the need to place corruption to do it. And that, of course, is where Torrent
Unique weapon and corruption. And, yes, Torrent only has 1 willpower, so that could be an issue. Maybe you want to do it on Feyenoord instead. Give him Girth Hang, so he has 5 attack.
Yes. Equally, if you have tried to turn Thingol into a multi-purpose hero with some readying, then presumably that means he has Ruth, so he's already 3 attack, and he does have the willpower for it.
Yeah. Certainly, compared to Heavy Stroke, I feel more inclined to use this, because with Heavy Stroke, for the cost of 1 resource, it's rare that you could get more than you would out of Khazad. Whereas since this applies to multiple attacks, it potentially multiplies up more.
Okay, next event then is Open Battle, which is a zero-cost event with the Plan trait, and reads Doomed 2. Action. Each player may search his deck for a weapon or armour attachment and add it to his hand.
So that's obviously a very powerful effect. If your strategy depends on using Ruth to get the extra resource icons, then this is a way to fetch it. The only real issue with it is that it's doomed to, which will raise everyone's threat, and potentially not everyone will actually have useful weapons and armor in their decks.
I think in that regard, it really does depend on number of players, potentially. But yes, that's the downside. On the other hand, I think open battle, I think the other thing is it might be worth it just to have, say, 2 players out in a 3-player game getting set up. Because if the mastery player needs to find Ruth, then, yeah, open battle is essentially acting as a 4th, 5th, and 6th copies of Ruth. The odds of getting one or the other in your opening hand are suddenly very good. And say you've also got another player who's got some useful weapon or armor in their deck. A 3rd player might be willing to take that 2 points of threat just so everybody's getting set
especially
up
if it's, say, a significant defense boosting armor and they have a sentinel defender. Everyone wants that to happen.
Exactly, yes.
And our final event in the Mastery Sphere is Dark Elf. It is again a 0-cost event. Only one of these events has actually had a cost.
Yes, beyond, in a lot of cases, corruption.
Yes. So Dark Elf is a 0-cost event, which reads, Action. Place X corruption on heroes you control to draw X cards. X cannot be greater than the number of heroes you control.
First thing to point out is that is obviously very good card draw. One of the things I've always considered about it is that it's very good if you're running a dual sphere spirit mastery deck, because the spirit heroes all have a lot of willpower. The ability to potentially, to make a hypothetical combination, if you've got, say, Feyenoord and Luthien, you might be quite happy to put 3 points of corruption from Dark Elf onto Luthien, sparing Feyenoord, who's generating enough as it is, to draw 3 cards.
Yeah, that's an important point to note, that while the amount of corruption you can place and cards you can draw is limited by the number of heroes you control, you don't have to spread that corruption equally among your heroes. So you have 3 heroes, you can place 3 corruption and draw 3 cards, but you can put all 3 corruption on the same hero, or 2 on one and 1 on another and none on the third. There are potentially ways you could try and cheese this to get even more out of it, though they'd be difficult. If another deck wants to play Desperate Alliance for some reason and give you another hero for a phase, you could do this. If you use the Sword Thane attachment from the Dread Realm, you can get a 4th hero. But to be honest, it's plenty good already. 0 cost to draw 3 cards. But yeah, you have to have the corruption, but if you're going to do this, then you plan for it and make sure you have the willpower and possibly means to remove the corruption afterwards.
Broadly speaking, I think that applies to any deck that's using mastery at all, is you think about what you're doing about corruption.
Yeah. That concludes the review of all the mastery cards in the first stage. We'll be moving on to tactics next. Thank you for watching and listening. Goodbye.